Our speaker this morning is Dr. Stephan van der Westhuizen from the University of Stellenbosch, where he is in the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Sciences. He graduated in 2024 with his PhD from the University of Westhuizen in the Netherlands. His PhD focused on a methodological framework for machine learning in digital soil mapping, and he has continued in this area of research, dealing with the statistical challenges involved with digital soil mapping, such as improving the statistical modeling of soil properties to enhance soil mapping accuracy and developing interpretive machine learning techniques using biplots. His topic for this morning is statistical modeling in digital soil mapping, opportunities and research avenues. Stephan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you to CoE-MaSS for allowing me to come speak today. So I am from a financial department, but my work is very much based on environmental research. So just a little bit about myself. So I added this slide because it's actually exactly today, a month ago, that I defended my thesis. And I see that one of my opponents is online. So it strangely feels a deja vu kind of vibes from me. Maybe the time is also to the date. No, it's an hour out. It was at 11 o'clock a month ago. In any case, so I'm a statistician. I lecture in this department, but my research is mostly on environmental projects, and I specifically like soil science, and I'll tell you why. That is a cover of my thesis that I presented a month ago. So I work in mainly statistical and predictive modeling in spatial domains. So just a bit of an outline for today. Maybe it's required to have a brief overview of DSM and why it is important to monitor soil. I will then talk the main statistical models that is quite popular in DSM. I'll then focus mainly on data challenges, so what we typically face, and I'll share some of my experiences during my PhD. Which of them I will also focus on interpreting machine learning, and then obviously also a brief overview of other challenges that are also very popular in DSM that could be very enticing for other people to also work on. So digital soil mapping, so I want to illustrate it with this schematic illustration. I'm not sure if people can see my mouse, but I'll use it anyway. So you start with a point map. So this is a map, and these black dots are locations in a certain region of interest. And at these points, we've measured a certain soil property. For example, it could be carbon or nitrogen. And the idea is then to take the information with what we find at these property locations and correlate them to a bunch of environmental predictors that we see on the right. So these are typically maps of the region. So usually they are satellite imagery, but it could also be more smaller scale, like from smaller devices. But what is important DSM in this specific spatial aspect is that these environmental predictors must form part of what we call a CLORT or a scorepan model. So this was introduced in 1941 already, but it was adapted in 2003. Basically, it just means that the maps that we include into our study needs to represent soil formation factors. So these are categorized as climate, organisms, relief, paramaterial, time, spatial information, and can also be other soil properties. So, for example, you could include maps of temperature, precipitation, those are the popular ones. Organisms means you add information on vegetation, which could be NDVI indices. Tree coverage is also quite popular. Relief is very important, especially in mountainous regions. So elevation, depth of valleys. Paramaterial maybe not that used so often, like rock formations. So when you include these types of covariates or predictors, you basically adhere to this Claude model. So then in a GIS overlay, we overlay these maps with our locations and we tabulate them. So as a statistician, you are maybe not that involved in these first kind of steps, although most of us who work in this environment can do all these things. But then obviously the statistician into this part where we build model with some f of x. And the idea is to then map from these black dots, the spatial locations, to one final prediction map. And then also what you can do is if you look at your final map and you look at the residuals of your model, so the residual will be calculated obviously only from where you have location information of the soil properties. You can do some geostatistics with your residuals to even improve the map if you find then significant autocorrelation still left. So this is just quite a big overview of DSM. I will quickly, why do we talk about, or why do we have to map soil? Why do we have to be interested in it? And then we'll continue with the statistics. So obviously soil provides a lot of things like food, raw materials. It regulates so many natural cycles. But for the more important reasons, I believe, is that soil is a huge host of biodiversity on Earth. And then it represents the largest terrestrial carbon pool, which is quite significant. One of the reasons I really like DSM is because there's this drive where soil is more and more being recognized as a legal entity, meaning, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but so more and more governments see the importance of soil and the protection for it. For example, in the European Union, we have the soil strategy, which was adopted 3 years ago. So there's all these drives all across the world to improve monitoring of soil. Unfortunately, not so much yet in South Africa, but it is hopefully starting soon. There is, for example, a project called Soils for Africa, where they will collect soil samples across the entire continent with 20,000 locations, which will be then an open access free data set that one can download and use for analyses like DSM purposes or more scientific purposes. So this is very good news in some way, because this tells us that there will be, if government starts to recognize this as very important, it means that there will be funding for this kind of research. And lastly, one thing that I recently found out is that soil formation takes thousands of years to produce a few centimeters. So this just highlights why this kind of research is important. So this kind of research has many aspects, but obviously I will only focus on the statistics for today. So back to the schematic illustration, there's a different parts where as a statistician we are mainly involved. So obviously the number one, the model building, number two, doing exploratory analysis on your data, tabulating your data. Three, which is not really part of the schematic illustration, but is model evaluation, something that's very important and something that I admire about the DSM community is that they are very adamant about uncertainty. So they don't just want final maps, they want uncertainty maps as well. So how certain are we of our predictions, which is quite nice. And then we're also quite interested in interpreting our models when we go back to, okay, so this is the final map, but how did the environmental predictors actually influence organic carbon or whatever you predicted? Number four, sampling is obviously also very big. I'm not so involved in that, but there's also a lot of statisticians working in that environment. So these points, 1, 2, 3, excluding 4, is what I will mainly consider today for the rest of this. Okay, so statistical modeling. So I won't go into a lot of theory or mathematics. It's just getting an overview of lots of topics. But something that's quite interesting is that soil science has actually been very important for the development of geostatistical theory over the last decades. But we've seen now over the last 10, 15 years that machine learning is gradually replacing geostatistical modeling. There's a nice paper they've written by my supervisor, Gerard Hefelen, who explains this. And there's for many reasons. Obviously, we want to increase our soil map accuracy. So that's one of the main reasons why a lot of people prefer machine learning compared to geostatistical models, because you can capture so much more of the very complicated relationships that exist between the soil property and your environmental maps. So it's also easier to work with larger data sets. Anyone who has done a bit of geostatistics and geostatistical modeling, especially in prediction tasks, knows that this is where it gets really difficult with geostats. It's methodologically also easier to work with. For example, you don't have those so many strict data assumptions like stationarity of your spatial information. It's faster, but it also comes with a bit of, we see a lot of abuse with machine learning in this field, where people use it to do very strange things. And these are things that I've picked up also with reviewing papers for journals. Okay, but this all obviously has a major disadvantage. Obviously, machine learning don't directly account for spatial information. It doesn't easily give us estimates of our uncertainty. And there could be a questionable trade-off between accuracy and model interpretability. So we know that in DSM, a lot of times there's a interest in to know how does certain covariate maps like temperature influence our predictions. And so if you just use black box machine learning, it will be very difficult to deduce that. But we know that there's a lot of research in interpretive machine learning that can help us with that. But even so, the interpretability that geostatistics gives us in terms of the spatial information is also very valuable, which machine learning is very far behind in. But there's also other data-related problems. So because geostatistics has been used for so long in DSM, there were many data problems already discovered and they were solved. And so many of for these kind of problems are still very open-ended questions within the machine learning environment. And so my PhD went into that a little bit. So how we tackle some of those data challenges with machine learning? And some of them were easier, some of them were not that easy to deal with. So specific models. So surprising, well, not that surprisingly, but tree-based models are very popular in DSM because they are quite flexible. We know, for example, with random forest, we can use QRF to produce estimates of our uncertainty. So it's actually quite doable. We also get the variable importance, which addresses that, a little bit of interpretability of our models. But obviously, neural networks, CNNs, are also used quite a lot in DSM. But I think random forest is one of the ones that really stand out. And I also quite like it because of its flexibility to tackle some of these data challenges that we address in DSM. Okay, so that was just a big overview of the drive that we see in the DSM modeling. So I will now go through some of the data challenges that we've observed and that some of the topics that I've discussed in my PhD or research in my PhD. So a massive challenge with soil data is that it's very much infected with all kinds of errors. So you can imagine gathering soil data in the field, taking those field estimates to the laboratory. All of those things come with errors. You have measurement errors, errors that are made in the laboratory. So there's a nice article that I list there that explains all these kinds of errors and how they can filter through statistical modeling. So with machine learning, what we've done is to create some kind of framework specifically for measurement errors. So we did this with weight. So we try to, we aim to create a maximum likelihood framework that allows you to weight the data according to the errors that we observe. So the errors are quantified by the measurement error variances, the variances of these errors. So, but that is also quite difficult to estimate because a lot of times we have absolutely no information on the kind of errors that we get with soil data, because labs don't just produce this kind of information. So sometimes what we get is we have at locations, we get repeats. So a single property at a single location will be repeated a few times. And from that, we can get some idea of what the variability is of the errors. But a lot of times we would have to depend on expert judgment. So experts would come and say, they are this certain, this is the error margins that you might expect. And then that's what we have to work with to get some idea of the variability of the errors and use that then in our modeling. So yeah, I mean, it's quite, in principle, quite straightforward, actually. So in terms of the weights, so this was illustrated with a case study, and hopefully you guys recognize the country of Namibia. Sorry, I didn't include a proper name there. But so you have a point map from different data sets that we have for this country. The map on the right is a point map showing the uncertainty for these observations. So here we wanted to model clay over the entire country. And so on the map on the right, you see the darker the color, the more uncertainty there is for that particular observation at that location. So it basically just means that for observations where we are more uncertain, we just want to weigh less in the model calibration. I won't go into too much detail right now. But yeah, in principle, it's not a very difficult thing. But in terms of the maximum likelihood, we have to consider the residual variance, which has to be constant, which complicated things. So we had this iterative procedure where we iteratively estimated model parameters, then the residual variance, and we went back and forth until we could stabilize the results. But so there are lots of questions still. Difficult questions from this is proper model calibration, proper model evaluation, because obviously your data that you use are infected with measurement errors, and this same data that you have has to be used for model calibration. The same data that's infected with measurement errors have to be used with model evaluation. So there's a lot of research going on this topic, specifically concerning those calibration evaluation. So another topic that I did, and which was quite interesting, which was also very multidisciplinary, was censored soil data. And so we see this with soil thickness. So this is illustrated with the schematic illustration to the right. So this is a side view. So D0 you can see as the surface. D1 at the bottom, the dotted line, is some sort of definition of what soil thickness is, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then A and B is your two locations. So at location A, the soil surveyor went to a certain depth, and this round indicator shows that we actually didn't hit the true definition of soil thickness. So that would then typically be a right censored value. Whereas at location B, we survey all the way to D1. So we hit the definition of soil thickness. So then that would be a non-censored observation. So the idea with this is to map soil thickness. Soil thickness is another soil property that's quite important, especially in agronomy problems where certain varieties of wheat, for example, there needs to be a good effective soil thickness for it to be effective. Talking a bit out of my experience, outside my expertise. But so first of all, in the paper we've done, where we looked at soil thickness, it was from different countries. One was from the America, one was from Switzerland. And each government in each country, they have different definitions of what soil thickness is. For example, the main definition that I think that most countries use is this: it's when you hit bedrock. So when you don't see any loose soil anymore. So there's that thing to consider when you look at soil thickness, is that how to properly define soil thickness and correctly, use that in your modeling. And so with censoring, we obviously use survival analysis, which was completely removed from the typical place where you find survival analysis. That is, in medical studies where you observe patients over time. here we observe soil observations in depth, so a bit different. So this was the first study where we looked to map soil thickness itself. So there were studies that looked at how to use machine learning to produce maps of the probability of exceeding certain soil thickness standards. So in soil science, there's these kind of thickness standards on which they survey. So for example, 1 to 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters, a meter, 1.2 meters, for example. So they produced maps at these depths and then modeled or predicted the probability of exceeding soil thickness, but nobody ever produced soil thickness maps itself. So, but that was quite difficult. So we looked at an approach called, where we used random forest again, because we wanted to compare this to survival random forests. So the random forest was weighted with probabilities of exceeding certain soil depths. So we called this the IPC, inverse proportional to censoring random forest. Sorry, I didn't include links here, but this paper is under revision. Hopefully it will be published soon. But yeah, there are still so many research still going on that is very current at the moment. For example, evaluation of maps, that you can imagine that is very difficult because, again, it's the similar problem to the errors. The data that you're evaluating with are also censored, some of them. So you have these different proportions of censoring that could happen between data sets. So one thing that we've done to counter for this problem is we evaluated models only up to a certain depth. So you could have, for example, maybe I should just go to the next slide to illustrate this. So here on the left, you can see the state of Maine in the US and the observations. So the spatial locations of soil thickness, and orange indicating whether it was not censored and yellow whether it was censored. So the maps we produced for this region is shown on the right. So to evaluate these maps, so you can see the more orange colors indicate the more deeper soil thickness. So this was for different types of random forest models, which is not that important to highlight right now. But what I want to highlight is with the bottom row of the maps that we see, is that we evaluated the models with some sort of truncation method. So we know it would be very difficult to evaluate the maps over the entire spectrum of soil thickness, but it's easier to, let's say, only evaluate the maps to, let's say, 100 centimeters, which for the map user is also quite sensible because a lot of times people will only be interested in the true soil thickness up to let's say, a standard depth, let's say a meter of 100 centimeters. And whether it's the true soil thickness is larger than that, they don't really care. So that was quite useful in this paper. But yeah, so there's still a lot of statistical research going on in this, specifically censoring and soil thickness, to help with these kinds of challenges that they face in VSM. Then this was also from my PhD. Multivariate mapping is also quite current at the moment. So it's the use of machine learning to model and map more than one soil property at a time. So obviously with geostatistics, this is quite easy. You just use code reading. And so we wanted to investigate how would multivariate machine learning work in this kind of environment. And it worked quite well. I won't go into the details right now, but this is just an example of where we used multivariate machine learning to model and map carbon and nitrogen for Germany. So it's Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and then the little one there at the bottom left is Luxembourg. So they call that the Benelux. So what's important with these kinds of projects is that they want, let's say, a carbon map and nitrogen map. But so if you model these separately, you might ignore very important covariant structures that exist between these data sets. So you need to have a single model to simultaneously model and map these soil properties. So this was only for 2 soil properties, but what we wanted to illustrate with how important it is to do this multivariately is you might be interested in derivatives of the property maps that you produce. For example, the CN ratio. So the CN ratio is basically just carbon divided by nitrogen. So you can just imagine if you have 2 maps produce independently a carbon map and a nitrogen map, and somebody goes and takes the carbon map, divides it by the nitrogen map, you get a CN ratio map. But that CN ratio map might be very illogical because of the relationship that was not retained or covered in with the two separate models. So this was quite a nice paper where we showed this. We also showed how we can use machine learning to perform simulation, conditional on your predictors, that can be very useful in lower the line of the pipe. Sorry, I'm not saying this right. So after DSM, there's a lot of studies that they do afterwards to investigate soil function analysis, soil functions, for example. And so these simulations could be very useful in those kind of studies that typically follow a DSM study, where they need well-defined distributions for soil properties. So this was just, so one of the key advantages of also doing it in a multivariate way is when you produce your final map and you calculate CN ratio map. So here you see, we also use random forests here. So you have the CN ratio map and the CN ratio map to the right that was produced with the multivariate random forest. So they kind of look similar. The multivariate random forest is a bit more smoother, which this I think was more preferable for the scientists. But the big advantage came when we produced these derivative maps was with the uncertainty. So you can imagine, by also accounting for the covariance between soil properties and getting to the derivatives like the CN ratio, there's a lot less uncertainty in your predictions. So this is illustrated with the maps on the right-hand side. So you have the uncertainty map for the RF. So this is basically calculated from maps that were produced independently with independent random forest models, whereas on the right was done in a multivariate way. So the lighter color just shows a lot less uncertainty for the map predictions. But yeah, so multivariate mapping is also still very current. There's not a lot of examples of where people properly use machine learning to do this. So maybe just as a side note, a lot of people using machine learning in DSM, but that brings us back to the abuse that we see in DSM. So we need statisticians to do these kinds of things and show examples of how to properly use machine learning to do all these kinds of things in this environment. I'm not saying, so obviously I'm not saying all scientists can't do these kind of statistics, but some of them are really good and some of them, what I've seen, maybe are not that knowledgeable about this. Sorry, that was a bit of a side note. Something that's also quite not just current in DSM, but it's currently all over, is the research in explainable machine learning. So there's a couple of acronyms. People say XAI, XML, IML, all mean the same thing. I see there was also a presentation on CoE-MaSS on this topic a few weeks ago. So gladly go watch that video to look into the details of this. But yeah, so this is very important research to help with interpreting the machine learning models back to your predictors. So how do temperature, how does cloud cover, how does precipitation influence the property that you are predicting? And it's very valuable research. So with XML, we can use a lot of visualizations to improve our understanding of how a machine learning model relates to the predictors. So for example, with partial dependence plots introduced by Friedman more than 20 years ago, Shapley values are very popular now, and also very popularized by the book by Molnar. It's important to keep in mind with a lot of these visualizations that come with XML, it's not strictly, I would say, an assumption, but you have to keep in mind that you assume that your predictors or your covariates are uncorrelated, which is obviously not that optimal, because we know in the environment, everything is just so complex. Everything is related to everything else. And also a lot of these visualizations don't come with goodness of fit measures. So you don't, when you produce a partial dependence plot, you're not maybe sure how well is that representing the marginal effect of a certain covariate on predictions and so on. So for these two question marks, because I know biplots, and I thought maybe biplots could be a very good example, to address some of these issues that we see in XML. So I'm going to go through an example that we've done, and then we'll come back to this topic. To illustrate this part of the research, the XML research. So we had this study where we wanted to map carbon in South Africa, and DSM research in South Africa is really in its infancy. It's very, very in the beginning stages. It's a very nice time to hop on at the moment. So we wanted to map carbon, topsoil carbon in South Africa. So the plots on the left just shows you the distribution of carbon across the country. And it also shows it per province. So we see KwaZulu-Natal has the highest concentrations of percentage carbon, and the Northern Cape and the West the least. But this is typical of what a lot of times that we see in DSM is that our data are always very highly skewed to the right. And then we obviously have this bound of zero. So you can't get a negative carbon or negative readings for soil properties. So these kind of things that you have to consider in your statistical modeling. So this is from the South African Soil Profile Database that you see on the top, showing the locations and showing the corresponding value for these properties at those locations. So green obviously indicating high values of carbon, at least 2, and then down to close to 0, which is the red. So we produced a map with machine learning based on these points, based on a lot of covariates, and we got good results. In our on our test data set, we had about more than 50% of the variance explained, which is, in the context of DSM, relatively good. But then when we looked at the final map, after we went through all this trouble of producing the maps and training the models, calibrating, evaluating the models, getting the final maps, we noticed these very strange artifacts in the map, especially if you look at the north, close to the Kalahari, we get these green shades, which doesn't make any sense because we know that should be light yellow or red. And so if this was a black box machine learning model, and it's very difficult to go look at what caused the predictions to do this. Also, we highlighted a region in KwaZulu-Natal, which we know is the best areas for carbon in the region. And then we got also some yellow regions there, which the soil scientists, which was part of this project, didn't like. So typically what you can do, if this is a black box, you can, for example, do some interpretive machine learning with some of your covariates and try to investigate what caused these larger predictions. Larger predictions in some of these regions. But also maybe just to look at what are relationships globally or regionally between the predictors and your final predictions. So this is just an example of with partial dependence plots that you can easily do in R. So these are some of the covariates that we had. So CZ stands for cloud cover, valley depth, elevation. I'm not going to go through all of these, but then you can typically see, okay, for different predictions in carbon on the y-axis, if I were to change the values in this predictor, how typically does the values change in my predictions? But like I said earlier, when you construct these partial dependence plots, you kind of assume that they are uncorrelated to other predictors, which is maybe a bit restrictive, and they are no really goodness of fit. So to address some of these issues, we considered biplots, which is a paper under revision, and hopefully will be accepted soon. So with these biplots, we basically aimed at explaining the machine learning model predictions with alpha bags. So you can see these round oval shapes. Those are bags illustrating different categories of predictions from large to small, green to red. And then the blind plot axes are the covariates that can be used to kind of see simultaneously between a lot of covariates, how do that compare with the predictions. Sorry if you're not familiar with biplots. I don't have time to go into this in detail. Maybe an upcoming talk we can focus mainly on this. But we've got some very positive feedback from reviewers who are very excited for this publication to come out. So hopefully it will be out soon. But yeah, so with this biplot, you have those two major issues addressed. So you specifically take correlation between covariates into account. So for example, if the angle between covariates is quite small, it means they are strongly correlated. And you can also see, for example, with cloud cover, for different values of cloud cover, you have, let's say, typically above 5,000, you have very large predictions for carbon. And when cloud cover is small, let's say at a value of 2,000, you get small predictions for machine learning because it's for the model because it's in the red here. So you can do that for each of these axes. And also you can use the biplot comes with goodness of first measures. So you can, for example, see this specific biplot had a quality of 60%, and you can also get predictivity values for each line, each axis that shows you how well this covariate is represented in this two-dimensional space, which is very useful for the person interpreting this work. Okay, so lastly, so that was mainly from my PhD, but I'm continuing my research in machine learning in DSM, and topics that are very current and very nice to work on, specifically in this environment. If someone is interested to contact me to collaborate, or students interested. So spatial machine learning is quite nice at the moment. So there's research going on here, for example, where basically to spatialize a machine learning model, you can just incorporate spatial information as covariates, like the coordinates, or create some distances. This obviously has some flaws. There's also a generalized least squares approach where they look at how to do it more formally to address spatial autocorrelation. So this is something that I'm also working on with some of my supervisors, where we're trying to also produce a machine learning model that's more spatial. So hopefully that will also be submitted and accepted soon. But yeah, so there's a lot of research going on in that environment. Something that is not just in DSM, but a lot of machine learning research is causal inference. There's a list publication that I have there. So if I have time, I would definitely go into this as well. And then lastly, a lot of soil data is compositional data. So for example, if you think about clay, sand, and silt, those are composites, which means that when you observe clay at a specific location, you would measure the percentage clay, the percentage silt, and the percentage sand. And those three must add up to 100%. So that is compositional data. So it means the data or the observations are unit sum constrained. So there's obviously a lot of models that can handle compositional data, but specifically for machine learning, to maintain the high accuracy level of machine learning for producing maps to be faster, this is quite a nice topic. And we recently got a postdoc who will start with this topic, but this is also a nice topic to go into if you know a bit about compositional data. So obviously there are many other challenges. I've just highlighted some of the more significant ones going on at the moment. But if anyone has more questions, they are more than welcome to contact me. Right, so in summary, I like working in DSM. I think a lot of people like working in DSM because the results are tangible. For people working in spatial, I know, or working with maps, and it's very tangible, and it really feels you make significant contributions to problems that matter at the moment. There's a long history and partnership between soil science and statistics, and it's nice to be part of that legacy, especially since a lot of statistical methodology that started with spatial statistics and geostatistics actually started in South Africa with Kriege. So it's nice to be part of that legacy. More importantly, the problems are complex and very interesting challenges to work on. So that would be, I think, enough to entice someone to be part of this research. Yeah, that's it. Some of my references. Thank you very much. That's my email address if someone is interested to contact me.